I'm a bit of an outlier here because I work for an NGO, and we don't do a lot of work with national states other than being nasty about them. We do a lot more work at local government level. And I thought I'd try and fill in some of the gaps. So I'm going to talk about what we're doing at local level, and I'm going to talk about gender issues, so it follows on naturally from Maria. I'm not actually a practitioner. I think I should fess up. I mean, I got a very good ringside seat, and I know lots of practitioners, and I watch them, and I write down what they do. So yeah, I haven't visited this program, but I've spent a lot of time writing up the case study and talking to the people who do work on it. So I'm going to talk about a program called Raising Her Voice, which is a 17-country, what we call a global program on women's empowerment. And each of those is a kind of indigenous women's empowerment project, which we brought together as a kind of exchange exercise. The one I want to talk about is in Pakistan, which is a hard place to do women's empowerment. But we found quite an interesting way to do it. So I'll answer the questions that were set. So the problem is massive restrictions on women's freedoms, both political, personal, even ability to leave the house, you name it, it's restricted. But that's not the only story about women in Pakistan. There's also actually quite a strong women's leadership. They've had women leaders, they've got women parliamentarians, very strong women as well. So the compromise that we struck was to work on women's leadership rather than grassroots women in general. And in terms of what we'd previously done, two elements to that. One is we've done a long piece of work on women's empowerment called We Can, which has been amazing. It's reached about 5 million men and women across South Asia. But the key thing was the partner, and we haven't really heard much about partners in the NGO sense today, but the crucial thing for us, if you find the right partner, which is deeply rooted, has all the local knowledge, has all the things we've been prizing all day already, then the question becomes, how do you manage the relationship with the partner? And in NGO world, the art is getting the right partners and finding the right relationship with those partners, and then everything else becomes a lot easier. So the partner we found was called the Orat Foundation, and they've been working for about 20 years, I think, on some of these issues, and had set up things called citizens' action committees around Pakistan, which were doing grassroots empowerment work with men and women. So what we did was, working with Orat Foundation, we agreed to set up the women's leadership groups in 30 communities. We would identify 50 women leaders who would be nominated by their citizens committees. So they are kind of both leaders but also representative. And they would form essentially the classic women's empowerment circles. They would get training, but actually they would mainly help each other. They would build confidence, they would problem solve. And what was interesting was, after a couple of years, they did an analysis across the 17 countries to try and identify if there was an emerging theory of change going on in these 17 programs. There's a lot of exchanges going on between them. And they identified two things. One is they identified that there were essentially 3 areas of empowerment going on. There was a kind of personal empowerment, what we call power within, which is women actually acquiring confidence to speak and to say no to domestic violence and to generally be more assertive. Social empowerment, which we call power with, which is actually women organising or feeling stronger in mixed organisations, and then those two leading to power to, political projection, power to make demands. And those 3 sort of powers were interacting and forming the basis of most of these empowerment processes. What were the results? You couldn't predict what the results were going to be, because as soon as you get these people organised and talking to each other, they just start doing things off their own bat. It's really annoying, messes up your entire plan. But what things that happened that came up were things like political representation, women standing for election, interesting women insisting on the legally mandated representation on zakat committees, the committees that spend charity raised through mosques. And a lot of the things they did were actually implementation gaps. There were things which were supposed to happen and were not happening, which is always the classic sort of advocacy target for NGOs. You like implementation gaps because you're already halfway there. The leadership groups had women from a number of different political parties, so it became quite interesting that there was a kind of rivalry by party, but actually a commonality in terms of being women in parties experiencing similar problems. And they worked together to come up with a women's manifesto for the 2013 elections, with some interesting targets in terms of quotas and legislation on domestic violence. But they also did things off their own bat. For example, after the floods in 2013, I think it was, they did a lot of work just mobilizing to get identity cards for women who'd lost them in the floods. As without the identity cards, women couldn't access a whole bunch of services. What were the politics of all this? It was crucial to have women political leaders championing this. Decentralization also helped. There was a lot of the women's leadership groups were separate. There wasn't a kind of easy target at national level without reduced risk. There was an interesting engagement with religion in the sense that the Orat Foundation have long found that you want to work with progressive scholars, but there's no point in wasting time with the extremists, with the extreme anti-women parts of Islam. So they actually built up a good relationship with progressive Islamic scholars, and that also helps reduce risk, but also gives you massive credibility and influence, with the people you're trying to work with. And the fact that the women were nominated by these citizens committees meant that they were actually nominated by men. So you didn't set up a big polarization of men v women, and that was avoided. How did learning happen? I think a lot of the learning happened through the fact that there were 17 countries involved and some really interesting exchanges going on between them. Oxfam's sort of gender advisors worked with Orat Foundation, and sort of they learned from each other. There was the usual amount of evaluation. I don't think we did a lot of numbers. We did a lot of conversations. I think that counts as evidence. It does in my book anyway. And then one interesting course correction, we actually had to start thinking seriously about livelihoods, because we found out that people can't eat seminars, and that they started to say, look, this is all great, but actually I need to earn some more money. So actually some of the women's leadership groups got involved in microfinance, and a bunch of other sort of initiatives took off. None of it predicted, all of it sort of emergent, and that was what was exciting about it.